It was just a normal Tuesday morning. A foggy airport. A tired man. A young woman trying to catch a flight. But in less than 60 seconds, a single sentence, just 9 words, should shatter both their lives and send shockwaves around the world. This is the story of what happened after the outrage faded, and the real work began. Have you ever had one of those moments? A single, fleeting second where everything changes? Where a life you've built for 30 years can just shatter? It often starts like any other day. This story is no different. It begins in the early morning haze at Sydney's Kingsford Smith Airport. You know that time, when the world is still rubbing the sleep from its eyes. The air was cool, misty, peaceful, even, but in that quiet terminal, a storm was brewing. A storm born from 2 completely different worlds, about to collide in the most painful way. To understand this collision, you have to understand the 2 people at its heart. First, there was Rob Walsh. Imagine a man who has done the same thing, day in and day out, for 30 years. His alarm blares at the same ungodly hour. He makes the same pot of too strong coffee. He drives the same route to the airport, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter each year. Rob was 58, and just a day before, his bosses had sat him down. They said his customer service scores were too low. They said if he didn't improve them in 6 months, his pension, the retirement he'd worked 3 decades for, would be slashed. Can you feel that pressure? That knot of fear and anger in your stomach? For Rob, that knot was everything. It was all he could feel. He saw every passenger not as a person, but as a threat, a potential complaint, another problem to manage. He was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, and he was convinced every single person walking by was there to push him off. Now, meet Chloe Obama. While Rob was brewing his bitter coffee, Chloe was in her apartment in Potts Point, looking out at the Sydney Harbor Bridge. At 24, she was fiercely intelligent, full of purpose, and on a mission to carve out her own name in the world. Sure, her last name was Obama. Her father was the Barack Obama. But she was Chloe. She was a lawyer, an advocate, a woman about to fly to Singapore to give the biggest speech of her life at a major human rights symposium. She was nervous, of course, but then her phone buzzed. A text from her dad. It just said, "You've got this, kid. So proud of you. Call me when you land." And just like that, her nerves turned to excitement. She was ready. But then a small change, a last-minute aircraft switch. Her flight was now leaving earlier. No big deal, right? For most of us, it's just an inconvenience. But this small, random change, it was about to change everything. It meant that Chloe Obama and her security agent, Maria Rossi, would now be heading straight to the first-class check-in counter and straight into the path of Rob Walsh. Music shifts slightly, becoming more tense with a subtle, low drone. Rob was already in a foul mood. An alert was flashing on his screen. The flight was overbooked. Another headache. Another problem caused by entitled people who thought they could just demand whatever they wanted. And then she approached. Chloe was calm, polite. She placed her passport on the counter. "Good morning," she said, with a warm smile. "I have a reservation for flight to Singapore." Obama. Chloe Obama. Something in Rob broke. The stress, the fear, the resentment, it all boiled over at that moment. He looked at this poised, young black woman with her nice luggage, and he didn't see Chloe Obama, the human rights lawyer. He saw a stereotype. He saw a challenge to his authority. In his mind, the daughter of a president wouldn't be standing in his line. She'd have a private escort. This had to be a scam. An audacious, brazen con. "I'm going to need more than that," he snapped, his voice dripping with suspicion. Calmly, Chloe offered her driver's license, her university ID. Her security agent, Maria, stepped forward smoothly, presenting her official ASIO credentials. "I can confirm her identity," Maria said, her tone professional and firm. But Rob's mind had slammed shut. He decided. He was right, and they were wrong. He refused to even look properly at the documents. He called for security. Can you imagine how Chloe felt? The heat rising to her cheeks? The sting of dozens of eyes now watching her? The utter disbelief? She kept her composure. Years of being in the public, I had taught her how to do that. To stand tall even when you're crumbling inside. "Sir," she said, her voice still steady, though you could hear a slight tremor if you listened closely. "There's clearly been a mistake. Please just check the system again." But Rob wasn't listening. He was doubling down. He told the security officer she was a fraud. He was loud, aggressive. A crowd was gathering now. Phones were coming out, recording the scene. The whispers grew into a roar of judgment. And then Rob Walsh reached his breaking point. Feeling cornered, humiliated, and utterly certain of his own righteousness, he leaned across the counter, and he said the words that would define him forever. The words that cut through the airport noise like a knife. "Get your entitled black ass out of my line. You think you're something special? I don't give a damn who you claim to be." Music stops abruptly. A moment of silence for the narrator to let the weight of those words hang in the air. The world stopped. The air left the room. Everyone heard it. Everyone. The other passengers gasped. The security guards froze, their hands hovering awkwardly in the air. The phones kept recording, broadcasting this woman's humiliation to the world in real time. And Chloe just stood there, her face a mask of dignity, but her eyes held a world of pain. The heat of 1,000 stares burned into her. She was being publicly shamed for the crime of existing. It was the lowest moment, the worst kind of collision, and in that terrible, silent void, a sound. A gentle buzz on the counter. Chloe's phone lit up. She glanced down, and despite the horror, despite the anger and the shame, a tiny, almost impossible smile touched her lips. She looked up at the red-faced, furious man behind the counter, and she spoke, her voice so quiet everyone had to lean in to hear it. "You might want to wait," she said, "just 2 minutes before you do something you'll regret for the rest of your career." She paused, letting the warning sink in. "My father has just landed." That silence after Chloe spoke, it was heavier than any noise. You could feel it. The entire crowd in that terminal was holding its breath. Rob Walsh, his face still flushed with anger, suddenly looked uncertain. The name Obama had finally cut to the fog in his mind, and for the first time, a cold, sharp sliver of doubt began to pierce his certainty. And then a shift. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a feeling, a change in the air pressure. Heads began to turn, not toward the drama at the counter, but towards the diplomatic arrival's corridor. A murmur, different from the earlier whispers of shock, rippled through the crowd. It was a sound of recognition, of awe. And then he was there, Barack Obama. He didn't need to say a word. He just walked into that tense, ugly scene with a calm that felt like a physical force. His presence seemed to lower the temperature in the entire terminal. He was dressed simply, but he carried himself with that familiar, steady gravity. His security detail moved with him, not with aggression, but with a quiet, protective assurance. He took in the scene in a single glance. His daughter, standing tall but visibly shaken. The furious supervisor, the crowd of onlookers with their phones out. He walked straight past Rob Walsh, as if he weren't even there, and went directly to Chloe. He placed a gentle, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I understand there's some confusion about my daughter's identity," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry, but it carried. It was quiet, firm, and it held an undeniable authority that made everyone lean in to listen. The effect on Rob was immediate and total. The last remnants of his anger evaporated, replaced by a gut-wrenching, soul-crushing horror. His face went from red to a sickly, pale white. The reality of his mistake came crashing down on him with the force of a tidal wave. He hadn't just been rude to a passenger. He had publicly humiliated the daughter of a former president of the United States. And he had done it with the ugliest words imaginable. What happened next was a blur of quiet efficiency. A mortified airline manager appeared, apologizing profusely. Chloe was checked in within seconds and escorted swiftly toward the first-class lounge. The show was over. The crowd began to disperse, already uploading their videos, making Rob Walsh infamous to the world in the time it took him to draw a single shaky breath. But before he left with his daughter, Barack Obama turned. He finally looked directly at Rob Walsh. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an apology. He looked at the broken man standing behind the counter and offered him a quiet, devastating observation that would haunt Rob for months to come. "I'd spend some time thinking," the former president said, his voice still calm, but now layered with profound sadness, "about why you were so certain she couldn't be who she said she was." And with that, he was gone, leaving Rob alone in the wreckage of his own making. Music shifts to something more solitary, introspective. The fallout was swift and brutal. Rob was immediately suspended. By the time he numbly collected his things and was escorted to his car, the video was already trending online. News alerts popped up on his phone. Airport supervisor in racist tirade against Obama's daughter. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from reporters, texts from horrified colleagues, messages from friends asking if it was really true. He drove home in a daze, to the empty townhouse that suddenly felt like a prison. He turned off his phone, drew the blinds, and sat in the dark silence. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him. It wasn't just about losing his job or his pension. It was about seeing himself, truly seeing himself, for the first time. He had to confront the ugly, hidden biases he'd carried for so long, the prejudices he'd never admitted were there. The man in that video was a stranger, a monster, and he was that man. Meanwhile, at 30,000 feet, Chloe Obama was also grappling with what happened. The humiliation was still a fresh wound. She could still feel every pair of eyes on her, hear that horrible slur echoing in her mind. She could have chosen anger. She could have demanded Rob Walsh be fired, made an example of. No one would have blamed her. But that's not who she was. As she looked out the window at the clouds below, she felt a different call, a call to purpose. Her life had been filled with lessons about grace, about meeting hatred not with more hatred, but with something stronger. When she stood on that stage in Singapore, she set aside her prepared speech on human rights law. She looked out at the audience and did something extraordinary. She told them what happened that morning. She spoke not with vengeance, but with raw honesty about the pain of prejudice. And then she announced her radical idea. She wasn't calling for this man to be canceled. She was calling for him to be taught. She revealed that she had asked the airline not to fire Rob Walsh, but to partner with her to create a comprehensive new program for unconscious bias training. She talked about the transformative power of grace over retribution. Back in Sydney, a week later, Rob received an email. It was an invitation to a meeting at a neutral location, a university conference room. The sender was a representative for Chloe Obama. He almost didn't go. The shame was too great. But something in him, maybe the last shred of decency he had left, made him put on his only good suit and go. The meeting was awkward, painful, and utterly quiet. Chloe was there, calm and composed. Rob could barely look at her. When he finally found his voice, it was choked with emotion. He offered a stumbling, heartfelt apology. It wasn't excused. It wasn't justified. It was just sorry for all of it. And then Chloe did the unthinkable. She offered him a path forward. She explained the training program, and she told him that she wanted him to be a part of it, not as a punishment, but as a contributor. His story, his experience, his painful self-reckoning. It could be the very thing that would prevent others from making his mistake. Music swells into something hopeful and uplifting. Months passed. Rob Walsh, the man who had been a figure of public hatred, threw himself into the work. It was painful. He had to listen, to learn, to confront parts of himself he'd spent a lifetime ignoring. But for the first time in decades, his work had a purpose beyond a paycheck. He was helping to build something good from something awful. The program launched. And months after that, Rob found himself standing on another stage, an aviation conference in Singapore. Standing next to him was Chloe Obama. They were an improbable duo, a living testament to the idea that people aren't static, that they can change, together. They presented their program, sharing their story not as a tale of villain and victim, but as a case study in human fallibility and the possibility of redemption. As they concluded, a figure emerged from the wings of the stage. It was Barack Obama. The audience gasped. He walked over, shook Rob Walsh's hand, a simple gesture that felt like the closing of a long, painful loop. It was a handshake that said, "I see your effort." I acknowledge your change." Then he turned to his daughter, pulled her into a hug, and said the words she deserved to hear. "I am so proud of you, not for your composure that day, but for your wisdom, for choosing to build a bridge where most would have built a wall." Music softens to a gentle, reflective melody. The story that began with vitriol at an airport counter didn't end with firing. It ended with a handshake. It didn't end with punishment alone. It ended with healing. It makes you think, doesn't it? We all have our moments of failure. We all have our hidden biases, our moments of fear and anger. But this story asks us a question. What do we do next? Do we double down? Or do we have the courage to look in the mirror? It's a story that proves that grace is not weakness. That true justice isn't just about getting even. It's about getting better. It's about the enduring, incredible potential for human redemption. And it all started with a young woman who, when faced with hatred, made the brave, beautiful choice to offer a second chance. You might think that was the end of the story. The handshake, the proud father, the redemption arc. It feels like a perfect closing scene, doesn't it? But life isn't a movie. The credits don't roll just because the hardest part is over. For Rob and Chloe, that day on the stage in Singapore was an ending. It was a new beginning. And beginnings are almost always messy. The weeks after the conference were a whirlwind. The video of their joint presentation of that handshake went viral all over again. But this time, the headlines were different. Instead of airport supervisors' racist tirade, they read, "From confrontation conversation, the unlikely duo fighting bias." The public reaction was complicated. Many people were inspired. They saw it as a powerful story of forgiveness and a blueprint for real, tangible change. Letters and emails poured into the airline and to Chloe's office, sharing personal stories and thanking them for offering a model of restorative justice. But not everyone was cheering. There was backlash. A loud portion of the online world accused Chloe of being naive, of offering cheap grace to a man who didn't deserve it. They argued that Rob's public shaming and firing were the only real consequences that fit the crime. Why should he get a platform? Why should he get a second chance when so many others never do? Rob saw these comments. He'd made the mistake of reading them late one night, and the words seared themselves into his brain. He's just performing. He's only sorry he got caught. She's a fool for trusting him. The doubt came creeping back. Who was he to think he could be part of the solution? He was a problem. The monster in the video. Maybe everyone online was right. He almost quit the program. He drafted an email to Chloe and the airline executives, resigning for the good of the initiative. He believed his involvement was tainting it. But before he hit send, his phone rang. It was Chloe. She didn't mention the online hate. She didn't have to. She'd seen it too. Instead, she talked about the work. She just finished reviewing the first set of feedback from the training pilots at Sydney and Melbourne airports. "Rob," she said, her voice focused and energized, "you won't believe the responses. The facilitator said the section you wrote, the part about that moment your brain just snaps shut about the fear and the pride that won't let you admit you're wrong. That's the part that's landing. They said it's the first time this stuff has felt real and not just like a corporate checklist." She was silent for a moment. The backlash, I know it's out there. But this, she said, her voice firm, this is the work. This is what matters, not the comment section. That phone call was a lifeline. It wasn't about forgiveness or feeling good. It was about purpose. Chloe wasn't asking him to be a saint. She was asking him to be a resource. She saw value not in his shame, but in his hard-won understanding of the mechanics of bias. So he kept going. He deleted the resignation email. The work became his anchor. He spent his days in conference rooms with psychologists, diversity experts, and airline staff, helping to refine the training modules. He learned the science behind implicit bias, which helped him depersonalize his own failings. He wasn't just a bad guy. He was a human being with a brain prone to taking shortcuts that were shaped by a lifetime of cultural messages he'd never questioned. Understanding that was freeing. It allowed him to take responsibility without drowning in self-loathing. He started co-facilitating sessions with a clinical psychologist named Dr. Amina Jones. The first few times were terrifying. Facing a room full of skeptical airline employees, many of whom knew exactly who he was and what he'd done, was harder than any morning check-in rush. He'd start by showing the whole clip, the one of him unleashing his venom at Chloe. He let the horrific silence in the room settle afterwards. He didn't flinch from it. "My name is Rob Walsh," he'd say, his voice often still a little unsteady. "And that's me. I am that man in that video. I'm not here to make excuses for him. I'm here to explain how he got there, so maybe you can recognize the path before you start walking down it." He talked about the pressure, the fear about his pension, the slow build of resentment. But most importantly, he talked about the split-second judgment, the story he told himself about who Chloe was before she'd even finished speaking. He called it writing the story in your head before you've even read the first page. It was raw, it was uncomfortable, and it was devastatingly effective. You could see the recognition dawning on faces in the crowd. Not everyone agreed with him. Some sessions were tense, even hostile, but they were always honest. A year after the incident, the program, now called Project Veritas, was rolled out nationwide. Rob was offered a full-time position as a facilitator and community liaison. He accepted, his reduced pension suddenly no longer a looming terror, but a manageable reality. The work had given him something far more valuable, a reason to get up in the morning. One afternoon, he was cleaning out his old locker at the airport administration building, a final, symbolic act, when he ran into Harold Fitzgerald, the operations chief who had suspended him. The two men stood in awkward silence for a moment. "Saw you got the permanent role," Harold said finally, scratching his cheek. "The metrics, the passenger complaint numbers, they're actually improving, especially at your old terminal." Rob just nodded. "Good. That's good." Harold looked like he wanted to say something else. An apology? A word of congratulations? Instead, he just clapped Rob on the shoulder, a clumsy but genuine gesture, and walked away. It was enough. Later that week, Rob had a final meeting with Chloe. She was back in Sydney briefly before heading to The Hague for a new position with an international court. They met in the same university conference room where they'd had their first raw, painful conversation. This time, it was different. The air wasn't thick with apology. It was filled with the quiet satisfaction of a project completed.